All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. I wanted to get this one out as soon as possible because I have a very positive review for you guys today. I've been reading, I believe, John A. Douglas's book, The Black Crown, the Book of or the Age of Adventures, Book One, or something like that. Proper. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it in the description. But anyway, this was a book that really, really surprised me, and I mean that in like the most terrifying way for an author. Like the first three chapters of this, I was not looking. It was looking bad, and I'll explain why. Number one, the book starts with a really poorly thought out glossary, and I mean, like why did you do this bad? In the sense that there's things like, oh, well, we're going to remove the word an hour and call it a hand of time. And then a finger is 10 minutes. And there was a bunch of stuff like that. You know, swapping words out to just make them say the same thing is something that you can do. But it's like not a good sign. I'm like, okay, well, you can do this. There usually has to be a good reason for it. And then I kept reading the glossary and it got worse because there was a bunch of like entries for like orc brat and orc born and orc shit. And I was like, these are unnecessary. These should be things that we get from context clues. And then I went to the arcane part of the glossary and he's like, this is what a mage is. And I'm like, oh God, please kill me. This is horrible. Oh man. And so I was like, and then there's a bunch of arcane terms that are just like the word, like a regular normal word that you use every day, plus the word plus the word arcane, like arcane backlash. And there's a bunch of stuff in there where these words were not necessary to put into a glossary because any sane author would just have them be explained through context in the first couple of times they're mentioned in the story. There was like your arcane affinity. It goes from poor to very high, and all the words in between poor and very high are totally normal words that have no magical, mystical, fantasy elements to them at all. There was a lot of that, and so I was like, ooh, this is bad. This is looking bad. And then I got to the prologue, and I'm like, okay, there's some good descriptive language, but like it just seems like it's your standard, like bleh, boring fantasy post-war, end of the war setting. We've finished off the enemies, and now we have to rebuild, kind of thing. And there's like a reveal that I'm not gonna, no spoilers. We're gonna spoil practically nothing here. There's a reveal, and the reveal is handled in kind of a weird way that like you certainly can guess what the reveal means pretty quickly, but like the way it was written, I was like, I don't know, was there a scar? Then you get the first two chapters that introduce the character Ragoth. He's the star of the show. He's got orc lineage and human lineage. And I was like, okay, this is kind of good. He's an interesting character, kind of surprisingly intellectual for an orcish character. Yada yada yada. Then I hit the third chapter, and and they kind of develop him a little bit. There's some fun stuff that goes on, and then they hit the third chapter, and suddenly we get a new character in a different place, and I'm like, oh no, oh no, oh no, not this, please, anything but this. And I was like scared. I was like, am I gonna hate this? But here's the thing. This ended up being a really, really good book. And like it totally makes up for the very rough start throughout the book because the glossary, whatever, it was poorly thought out, but like the rest of the world was pretty well done, and the actual writing is good and descriptive and stuff like that. But man, I was worried. Yeah. So and the reason I bring up Dragonwing is because the thing that I couldn't stand about this book is that I read 3 chapters of it, and then I was like, cool, these characters are kind of interesting. What happens to them? And then it switches to completely different characters with really awful writing in that second chunk. And then the second chunk is over, and the third chunk starts without warning and introduces a different set of characters. I'm like, I'm done. I can't read any more of this. This is garbage. And so, like, I was worried that, like, these characters were going to go off like that, and maybe they'll come together at the very end. Who knows? But, like, we're going to end up with this disjointed narrative structure that's going to totally, like, these two characters are not related to each other in any way. And I was like, bleh, I hope that doesn't happen. And thankfully, it did not. Very quickly, the Ragoth and Cortland meet, and they start to have an adventure together, basically. After they meet, there's some dark stuff that happens, but there's never really like reveling in like being gross or dark or anything. Stuff happens that's, bad, and people get hurt and killed and stuff like that, but it's never like especially like gleeful in its description of that. And in fact, as you get further in the story, the tone becomes a lot lighter and more comedic. At some point I was almost thinking kind of like Pratchett, but without that satirical edge. Things are mostly played straight, and the jokes are even played as jokes and not like, haha, I'm saying something funny about the real world, just doing it roundabout way by creating Ankh-Morpork, right? So, good. The setting is, I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna say it's a fairly tropey fantasy setting. It doesn't try to like break new ground with new things that you've never seen before, but at the same time, enough of these tropes are kind of flipped or turned around in a way that keeps you guessing about what's going to happen with the next element of world building that happens. And so it's good. It's standard fantasy stuff that you've probably read before, at least in the sense of the world building in a lot of places. But there's enough places where something interesting is happening that you're like, oh, cool. This is kind of nice. So this is a neat description. Oh, okay, yeah. This is where the magicians live, and it has these characteristics, and there's this neat detail, and there's always a lot of colorful characters that have fun interactions. There's a lot of dialogue, and the dialogue is pretty good for the most part. There's the story itself is kind of this classic hero's journey, but one of the major elements of the hero's journey, right, is the mentor character, right? The character who starts the character on the hero's journey. And there are some really cool, like, false mentor type characters that appear throughout the book that help twist the plot a little bit and keep you both guessing and interested about what's going to happen next. There's a decent amount of foreshadowing here and there for various things that end up being revealed later in the book. Most of that is pretty good. Some of it is a little bit clumsy. I would say that like some of the foreshadowing was like, yes, I know I get it, thank you. And then there was like more, and I'm like, I get it, thank you. Right? And when you get foreshadowing like that, where it's like, yes, I understand, thank you. And then like later on, you're not even really trying to figure out the foreshadowing. You're just like, I get it, next. And then they're like, by the way, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I get it, next, please. And then they're like, a reveal! I'm like, okay, we knew most of this. I like the fact that you didn't just make it a reveal of this, but you added this extra 50% to the reveal. That's great. But, like, this is not a surprise. That much of a surprise, at least. What I'll say is that there are a lot of really cool environments. There's creative geography and ideas put into the world, into the shape of the world, into the architecture of the cities, things like that. There's a really fun twist in the second half that leads the plot in an unexpected direction, but it kind of gets back to where you would have expected it to end without the twist. So that's an interesting device. It's something that you have to be careful with because you can feel a book where there's a plot twist that leads back to where you were expecting to go in the first place can be really unsatisfying, right? Because you're like, oh, well, we did all this extra stuff to end up exactly where I expected to be. Okay, fine. However, in this book, I would say it's pretty well done. You enjoy the twist and all of the things that it changes about the characters and the plot that makes arriving where you expected to arrive a lot more fun. And that's what I'll say about this story, is it's very fun. There's I was very worried that it was going to be one of these dark, drab, dreary, punch you in the gut every minute stories. But actually, it's got a lot of like nuanced commentary about like social stuff, like just like the being a person who's out of place where you are kind of thing, and it's all handled with a fairly light touch, so that it feels like it's supposed to be there, and it feels like this character is really learning things about the world that he didn't know. And there's a lot of really good development like that. And so I found myself really, really enthralled by many of the characters, and really enjoying spending time with them, to the extent that last night I was expecting to go to bed relatively early, and this book kept me up for an extra hour, and I didn't even realize it. And so, like, yeah, it's a really solid story. It's got a really good plot with a couple of really good twists. There's a little bit of clumsy foreshadowing, but it does not detract from the story in any significant way. And the other thing is that I kind of liked at the end of the story how, if you've ever seen the movie Hot Fuzz, fantastic movie, one of the best comedies of the last 20 years, like amazing, amazing movie. And one of the things that they say in Hot Fuzz is like, you couldn't do this without accumulating a fairly significant amount of paperwork. And there's actually a bit of that at the end of this book. Some of the big reveals happen during the paperwork, so it's not boring. But like, there actually are some realistic consequences to some of the things that these characters do that catch up with them later on at the end of the story, and that drives kind of the last 2 or 3 chapters of the book, which are a really good falling action in the sense that it ties up a lot of loose ends, creates some possibilities for future stories, teases a bit here and there about various things, and just all in all is a good way to kind of like, you get that crescendo of the climax and the maximum action. You get a really cool resolution of something that's been kind of hanging over the head of the story. Something that you know about, but the characters don't know about. And so there's this thing, and you're like, oh god, this is still coming, and then there's a really clever resolution for that that really ties everything together, and you get this really satisfying ending. And then you get like an additional little bit of falling action that gives you a little bit of a more feel of like, well, what actually were the consequences of when they did this or when they did this, and does this have anything going on later in the in the world, or does this get resolved later on? And in fact, it does. So yeah, this was a really surprising story for me, because the first day I started reading it, I was terrified, and then the second day I was like, oh, this is really good. And then the third day I was like, this is still really good, and oh yeah, I should have been in bed an hour ago. And then I finished it up this morning and was like, okay, this is an interesting ending, because it does have that Hot Fuzz ending to it, where they're like, oh yeah, we totally did that, and that might be a problem, so we need to deal with that at the end. And of course, it wasn't just we're writing paperwork or we're doing this or we're doing that. There were actually some cool reveals in there, and a little bit of cool character development as well that feeds into what might be coming next. So yeah, I have, if you like fantasy at all, and I can't, like, normally my reviews are like, well, if you like pulps, and that's a pretty narrow niche, or like if you like engineering science fiction, right? If you just like to hear about the way that astronauts get trained, right? That was The Object, right? I did that review, and it's like, some people might like this, right? And then, like, it's like, well, this is kind of pulpy, this is kind of dated, this is kind of this. And I was trying to narrow it down a little bit. But man, if you like, epic fantasy, and you would like to see a classic hero's journey with some cool twists, I have to recommend this book to a very wide audience. Like, people should read this, because it's really, 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 really good. It's got fun characters. It's got good dialogue. It has a little bit of social commentary here and there, but it doesn't ever beat you over the head with it. It's got a really rough start, so like, watch out for that rough start. But if once you get through there, you'll be like, oh, this is actually really good, and I really like these characters, and I really like the way that they interact with each other, with their environments. I like the creative ideas about the things that they're going through and the places that they're visiting. I really like the way that the action ramps up right at the end. Not too sharply, but like very satisfyingly. And then the ending is just this really great denouement where you just get, all of the loose ends tied up. Things calm down. You get a few more character interactions that are interesting and fun, and you get a little bit of a lead in for things that could happen later in later books. And yeah, I mean, like this was a really good read. That terrified me the first day I started reading it. So yeah, that is my review of The Black Crown by, I believe it's John A. Douglas, and I really should have double-checked that before I started the review, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Really solid fantasy story. If you like fantasy at all, I recommend it. It's not ever too dark. Like, it is a little bit dark in places. There's definitely, some dark elements to the world building. But at the same time, it's handled in a fairly, in a descriptive but not gleefully disgusting sense. You know what I mean? Like, there's some authors that like get into like really, really jamming their thumb in your eye and really twisting it, and they're like, "Argh!" And you're like, I didn't enough. But this doesn't ever really get that bad. So yeah, this is a strong recommend in fantasy, and I was really surprised because the start I was like, ooh boy, and then like I just got into it. So yeah, give this book a chance. Skip the glossary; you don't need it. If you want to go back to it, go for it. If you're gonna do a glossary, if you're thinking about writing a glossary for a fantasy story, spend some time on it. Really think about it, because you might not need it. Most of the words that should go in a glossary should be handled by context clues, and the only ones that don't are things that are like replacements for regular words. And if you're going to do that, you need to have more of them, because there was only like a couple of them, and it's like, I don't need to use the word hand in place of hour. There's not really. I mean, I won't say that there's zero gain to world building for doing that, but at the same time, it's just like, come on, really? And then having a bunch of stuff that's like, I know what a mage is. Please don't. Oh God, So yeah, get through the first, I'm gonna say 5 chapters before you decide whether you're gonna pick this one back up or set it down for good. Because I really think that by the end of the 5th chapter, and that's not counting the prologue, so prologue plus 5 chapters. After the end of the 5th chapter, I think you'll discover that any issues that you had with the way that the book was going kind of fade away by that point. So yeah, strong recommend in fantasy. Skip the glossary, and give it a few chapters, because it does take a while for things, because there is that horrifying change in narrative style and position that like can ruin a story. Even a fantasy story with pretty good world building, that like, and I liked Dragonlance when I was a kid. I mean, seriously, this pissed me off. But like, yeah, this book did not piss me off after like the 4th chapter, because when I saw the second narrative and I was like, oh God, no, and like they just come together really quick, and you're like, cool, all right, we have an adventuring party here, and we're not going to be playing around with this other thing is happening 1,000 miles away from this other thing, and we're going to switch back and forth each chapter. Like, that is not good storytelling. That is a way to turn 2 novellas into a novel. And like, you can do that, but I don't recommend splitting them up chapter by chapter unless you have a damn good reason for it. So yeah, that's all I've got for today. And by the way, it can work if you have like a really short story that is a side thing, like like that can work, right? But if you have like 3 full-length novels that are split up into sections of 3 chapters apiece, that can be very jarring to the reader, and this does not do that. So that's enough of me ragging on Dragonwing, I guess. So anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'll have links in the description to the Black Crown, and I'll link to. I think he does YouTube videos with like reviews and stuff. So like that, you might find stuff that's fun there too. Anyway, so yeah, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. It's Friday for me, and this video will be coming out Friday afternoon. So I hope you all have a good weekend, and I'll see you guys on Monday. See ya.